Hey, it's really interesting so far, right? We've learned about my speaker notes, and of course, the title's slightly different. I have a better title: Great User Research for Non-Researchers. And as a researcher myself, I think this is a really exciting topic to be talking about. Most people in the user research community, we have concerns sometimes about what happens when other people go out and work with users. And I think most researchers look at this as a way to empower everyone to do well. I don't think we want to be the user research police or anything, and I hope that's what you find where you work. It's just the reality that the demand for user research exceeds the supply of researchers nowadays. And there's so many benefits for everyone when research, as people are talking about it now, is democratized. A colleague has begun referring to both researchers and people who do research, which she abbreviates PWDR. So I think this talk is about, in the time that we have, trying to level up PWDR. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas: planning research, doing research, and acting on research. Let's phrase it another way, though. I think the goal is learning from customers, and I'd encourage you to consider that in a broad sense, to not just look at, is the product we're making usable, or do people like the thing that we're making? There are many more questions that we can ask, and many more things that we can learn to inform what we do as a business, and what we build as in terms of being in that business. So take some time to plan and identify your business question. What is our challenge as an organization? And with that goes your research objective. What information would help you decide or act on that particular business question? And both of these are before you get to the specific questions that you ask participants. You can start in your planning with any one of these 3, but make sure you kind of flesh out all 3 of them and create these different, identify the questions in a way that sort of acknowledges the interdependence of these 3 pieces. I talked with a UX manager last year who was just so frustrated by her organization's eager approach to test all the things. I mean, for many people, testing seems to be their overarching term for user research and kind of the general mindset for how we use research in developing products and services. But testing is a type of research, but it's certainly not the only one. And what I think we're looking to do is try to deeply understand behavior, needs, meaning, desires, not just try to validate, not just look at the product, not just look at the solution. There's many methods. This is kind of a frequently cited paper by Christian Rohr, and it's a great paper if you have questions about this. He looks at, it's called When to Use Which UX Research Method, which you can Google that. There's a whole paper there that says if you're in this situation, you should use these methods, and this will kind of get you to this result. People have been for years trying to sort of lay out the landscape of methods and figure out which ones to use, and this is the best example that I think I have found over the years. But I think it's also just important to keep in mind this is not an exhaustive list of methods. We make new methods up all the time depending on the situation that we have. And the best approach for you is going to be contingent on what's your business question, like we talked about in an earlier slide. Who we learn from, who we build for, who we sell to. You don't need to think of research as simply looking at the people who are already using your product. You can do something different. You may want to build for someone that's different than who you seek to learn from in doing user research. For example, you can learn things from lead users that illustrate, by contrast, what it is that your target user has as a defining characteristic. It gives you new perspectives on other kinds of customers. So think broadly about who it is you want to talk to, not just who are we selling to now or who are we building for. You should also keep in mind that your users are part of a system, and that even if you aren't selling to kind of every node or every individual in this entire system, these other people have an impact on what success looks like. They have an impact on usage. It's a system of people collaborating together across tools and platforms and so on. So you need to look at as much of that as you can to understand places where success or failure may be introduced in adoption that's beyond just sort of your so-called initial target. As an example, I was doing research to learn about our client had a new way of delivering surgical technology into the OR. So we talked to all these different surgeons, but we also talked to the OR administrator, the scrub techs, the first assistant nurses, the departments that order supplies, the departments that clean supplies and equipment, all to understand the implications of this new product, this new technology delivery system into this complicated system. So that's, understanding all those perspectives was key to figuring out what direction this company needed to go into. All right, let's talk about the doing of research. And we'll talk a certain amount about just asking questions of people and interacting with people to learn from them, regardless of whatever kind of in-person or interactive research method you're using. These things will come in handy. Specific questions are better than general questions. So how do you typically choose a contractor is a hard question to answer. It presumes that the person you're talking to, your participant, already has a set of practices in place, and if they don't, they may make something up as a way to address your question. So instead, ask about the last time they started a project, and in that case, how do they choose a contractor? And then ask about whether or not that represents a pattern. It's easier for the person to give you a more realistic and a more specific answer that way. You can build up to understanding what the generalizations are from that. In this particular example of Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Broken Record, he does two really nice extensions to this principle about specific and general. So when he's interviewing this band, when they give a vague answer like, it doesn't work for me, he asks for a specific example. What does that look like? Give me an example. So he follows up. When people refer to some process they go through and they describe it vaguely, he asks them to show him what that is. Show me what that looks like. So you can take this principle further, just asking follow-up questions to get to specifics when you're given in general answers. Don't put answers in questions. This is a bad practice that many people default to. So a good question is, what happens to the package when it arrives? The bad practice is to say, what happens to the package when it arrives? Do you open it, or do you give it to somebody else, or you do this? It's a really hard habit to break. I encourage you to practice it and just see how hard it is to break that. And if you think, well, the participant can just simply say, well, no, it's none of those, it's this other thing, you're underestimating how much power you have when you are talking to someone and asking them about what it is that they do when you're doing research with them. Eventually, and maybe it's not the first question or even the second question, but eventually they're going to start giving you answers that are within the framework that you have presented to them. They're not going to step outside that. They're trying to do a good job, and you're basically training them how to do a good job for you. So again, this is very hard to stop doing. Everybody I work with struggles with this. I've been practicing this for years. I still fall back on this. So just be aware of it and try to break this habit. You'll get much better results. Hold off on, OMG, I'm the same. I think the naive approach to building rapport, to having this connection with somebody when you're talking to them and trying to learn about what it is they do, it's that the naive belief is that you can connect with this person by telling them that, hey, I'm just like you. And what that does is it takes focus away from the participant. You want this to be about the participant. The best practice is to just hold off on that reaction. Like you may feel OMG, you recognize something in common with them, you don't have to say it. You can very occasionally and calmly reveal your own perspective or your own experience. That happened to me as well, or I like that as well. But do it only if it helps normalize something that they're uncomfortable with. If they're fine just telling you about themselves, you don't need to share about yourselves. This is really, again, a default assumption that if you find yourself doing, I'd encourage you to step back from. Deflect roadmap questions. If participants start asking you questions like, will the next version have the Search Console integrated? Do not answer them. Once you do that, you become the expert. It's basically a very expensive tech support or marketing call. It's almost impossible to go from that back to research mode, where they're the expert and you're interested and curious. So you can use the standard researcher deflection, which is to turn around and say, why is that important to you? Or if that feels too confrontational, you can just say it like this: I'm going to act like a researcher, and I'm turned around and ask, why is that important to you? Either way, do not take those questions. Hold your advice and your fixes till the end, if at all. In addition to hearing people mispronounce your brand name, you'll also hear people wish for features that do exist. Don't interrupt the interview to explain your product to them. Keep quiet. It may be hard. It probably is hard. Sometimes we say sit on your hands. Do whatever it takes to not switch into representing what it is that you're making. Otherwise, again, you make yourself the expert. You want them to be the expert. At the end, if you're all done, you're wrapping up, you can mention to them things that came up, but think about what's going to help them. This is not your chance to evangelize your new feature or try to encourage them to do the kind of usage that you're hoping that they would do. It's about something they needed help with. And you can just be very sensitive about it. You mentioned you were looking for video tutorials. Would you like me to show you some of those? Speak their language. Sociologists talk about natural language, the way people in a certain group refer to things. Sometimes local terminology is going to vary from yours. So when you can, as you learn those terms from someone, reflect those terms back to them in your questions. Speak the language that they speak. Also, don't try to be cool and presume shorthand that they haven't shared with you. If someone mentions National Geographic, don't ask a question about Nat Geo. Use the language that they use. And this reinforces, again, they're the expert. You're curious about their perspective and their experience. Questions will generate stories. It takes a while as you establish this rapport with somebody, this comfortable back and forth. It depends on you, depends on that person, depends on just what's going on for everybody that day. This might take 10 seconds. It might take 10 minutes. It might take 45 minutes. You don't really know. So you have to be patient. But you can think about this visualization where eventually the interview moves from question, answer, question, answer, question, story. Just because that person isn't effusive right away, just give them a chance to be comfortable with you and being asked questions about whatever topic you're talking to them about. And you shouldn't let yourself get too uncomfortable if things feel awkward for a while. It's just to keep asking questions. That's kind of the mantra here. Most questions are follow-ups. You can have a list of questions prepared. You should. But most of the questions you actually ask and the way that you ask them should be emergent. They should come from what the person just said. So you're going to need to follow up to get clarity, to get more detail, to get to a point where you understand what it is they're trying to tell you. When you go back to something from before, tell them, I want to go back to something you said before. When you change topics, just tell them you're changing topics. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here, and maybe we can talk about planning out budgets now. This all reinforces that you're paying attention to what it is that they're telling you, and it's important, and you're interested, and you want to know more about it. Or it tells them that you're partnering with them in this conversation, and that you're making sure they're tracking with you where it's headed. This all really increases the comfort. When it comes to showing prototypes, I find a lot of teams default to taking out their design process artifacts and, there's that word again, testing them, and missing the opportunity to create new things to show in the field that are not part of what you're planning to build, but are tangible, experiential, visible artifacts that people can play with or react to as a way to provoke a deeper reflection on their underlying issues that you want to understand. So imagine this ridiculous flip phone. You aren't going to make this product, but you could use this artifact to show someone as a way to have a different conversation than you could otherwise have about form factor, about losing your device, about interacting with the keypad, and so on. Beware of satisficing, and I'm sorry for the poor quality picture. It's a stealth shot I took on board a plane of the people in front of me who rigged up an iPhone holder using the plastic bag from the blanket. They made a sling and they jammed it into the tray table hook. This is a great example of a satisfice. It's a good enough solution. Satisfice comes from the words satisfy and suffice. And it's an important concept for designers and researchers because people have a pretty high tolerance for good enough solutions. And when we see them in research, we sometimes think that those are opportunities. Sometimes they are. You know, some aircraft interiors now have clips on the seat backs where you can mount your device and watch during the flight. And sometimes they aren't. Sometimes people will keep putting up with a non-ideal solution. And you can think about the cost of tolerating that solution, that non-ideal solution, that compromise, versus the cost, the financial cost, the switching cost, the cognitive cost of adopting a new solution. If the cost is zero, like it's in the seat back already, then sure. If the cost is higher, like it's something the traveler has to learn about, purchase, pack, carry with them, then maybe this is just fine for them. So, you know, thinking about the behavior change required, not just rolling out new fixes because you can, because those won't get adopted. You know, and for us as people who observe, try to see what people are doing as something that actually works well enough for them, rather than something that we're here to improve. Make a recording. Just mechanically, given how fast people talk and how fast you can possibly type or write, you cannot take notes well enough. You need a fully accurate document of the conversation you have with people. You need to have it there so you can go back to it and have it be exact. The notes you take are appropriately interpreted based on what you heard or what you think that you heard. So you need to make that recording that captures in all the accuracy and detail. Make notes as a way to help you process what's happening in real time. Make marginal notes and little sketches, jot things down. That's great, but that's not the capture of what happened. The recording is how you capture what happened. Biases. I think people tend to really get caught up in biases. Like the word comes up all the time, and it's easy to see why. There's so many of them. It's an overwhelming number of biases. Cognitive biases you can look up and just feel a little depressed by. So, you know, just quickly, I think my way of looking at it is to work on hearing your own bias. When you have those moments of being wrong about something, when you discover that, to reframe it so that uncovering your own judgment is joyful. It's freeing, it's liberating. You go from, oh, I was wrong, to I am learning. And you want to apply this kind of mindset to any moment in the research, not just about things they tell you about your product. It's about anything that you encounter when you're doing research. You can also practice this in your life in general to kind of, you know, build these skills to be excited about being wrong and in fact actually learning at that time. Empathy is a word we talk about so much, and there's a lot of hopefully obvious reasons why that, you know, in our lives and our professions, having empathy is important. But for research, it's important because it's how you do the work. Understanding the contours of someone else's perspective and experience when it differs from yours, well, that's what it takes to do research. That is really what you're trying to learn in the first place. So being judgmental, which is a very human thing, gets in the way. We all do it. What did you think when you saw that plastic bag on the iPhone sling that was making an iPhone sling? What will you think when you see that from one of your participants? To confront our own judgments, first learn to hear yourself making those judgments. Then practice simply questioning your assertions. Maybe that isn't true. If you can, get more data to flesh out a new conclusion. But even if you don't get new data, just going through that activity of saying to yourself, maybe that isn't true, that opens you up to the kinds of revelations that we're seeking in the field. Empathy and judgment are tied together. They are in adjacent regions in the brain. And there's an amazing life hack for when you are feeling judgmental and angry. And you can do this at any time. It doesn't have to be in research. For me, I was traveling recently, and I had a long morning walk to get to meet my friends, and I was late, and I was hurrying, and I was feeling kind of grumpy, and I went through a park, and there's a bunch of people crowding around, getting off tour buses, and just kind of being in my way, and I felt really annoyed and critical of them. And as I was walking, I passed this three-generation family, and the mom was like trying to take a picture of everybody else, and I just made eye contact with her and wordlessly kind of suggested that could take a picture. So she hands me the camera. I take a vertical shot and a horizontal shot, and I hand it back, and I go on my way. And they were quite happy. They expressed a lot of gratitude. But the thing about this story is that I felt so much better. Beyond being a good person in the world, this is good for us. As the person who extends empathy, we feel better. And finally, there's some brain science that tells us that stress limits our empathy. So in setting up research projects, make sure you set them up logistically so they're reasonable. Not too many sessions. Make sure you have breaks. Make sure you know how to get from A to B. You have your driving directions, your technical stuff, all that things that stress you out. Make sure that they're taken care of, because this is what you need to do in order to do the work of having empathy, which is learning about somebody's experience and how it differs from yours, which is why we're doing the research in the first place. All right, the last section is acting on research. Sometimes the belief is that once you talk to people, maybe you write up the key takeaways for each, and you throw it into a deck, and you're done. And that's usually insufficient to get the value out of the research. We talk about insights, but insights are not something that you just collect and tabulate. They're the outcomes of a process. And if you want to get something beyond the obvious, literally the things that people said they wanted your product to have, you have to go through this process. And it's a process of analysis and synthesis. Analysis is taking things, larger things, and breaking them down into smaller pieces as a way to make sense. So you can think about an interview or a session, a transcript. You pull out a few elements, a few stories, a few anecdotes. That is sense-making. That's analysis. Synthesis is combining those smaller elements up into a new thing, a new framework, a theme, a finding, a recommendation, a conclusion that you have interpreted and created. That's something new that you have processed. That's synthesis. And this can be time-consuming. I think the more you put in, the more you get out. But I'll tell you that some people plan for 2 to 3 hours of analysis and synthesis for every hour they spend doing research. Here's an example of analysis, looking at a transcript and marking different parts of what the participants said, just based on the issues and concerns and so on that they suggest. So you can go person by person and see what each person identifies. That's analysis. And you can take all those issues that you've identified and put them together into a larger framework that includes the patterns and your concluding point of view about them. That's synthesis. A shortcut for doing analysis is to look at the words that people use and the meaning. People tell us things in research, and we might assume that they're using the words the way that we are, especially if it's a technical term or something that we use internally. So reporting can be multiple things. A solution might not mean what you think it means. So look closely at what they said and what you assumed those phrases meant from the larger context of the conversation, which says something about how they understand the term. But sometimes when you feel surprised or confused by how somebody is using a word or how they're describing their behavior, that's a cue that you need to look more closely at what it is that they're saying and what they mean by it. Some of these are things that you clarify in the field, like the example I was just reading where people explained that computers talked to the printers, but in fact, that was just the team's local terminology for a complicated upload and transfer process. But if you don't clarify them in the field, because maybe you don't at the time realize these are things that mean different than what you expect, you can definitely find those things in your analysis process. It's a silly example here, but when you think of the phrase power trip, that brings something to mind. You have a certain interpretation. But when you see this sign, and you have a different interpretation of what that phrase means. Just as a reference, if anyone wants to take a picture of this, it's a great detailed post by John Kolko. It's a step-by-step recipe for doing analysis and synthesis that he wrote a couple months ago. It's very detailed, tells you what kind of spreadsheets to create and how to print them out and what fields to put. It's a lot. It's not about how do we pull meaning out of what people are saying, but it tells you how to kind of operationalize the process of going through all this data. For researchers, a familiar response is this dismissive, oh, we already knew that. And you may hear this as pushback yourself when you start sharing what you've discovered, but you have to ask your audience, really? Did you? Sometimes something being familiar or feeling true isn't the same as already knowing it. Recognition is not recall. And beyond that, confirmatory findings are valuable. There's a lot of reasons why research results get rejected, and one is the discomfort that comes from having to change your mind. At best, it's inconvenient. A few years ago, a client asked us to look at ways that people were using a certain popular personal technology device, and they had already hypothesized several categories of usage. And so we looked at those, and we looked beyond that, and we came back to report that the most crucial areas of behavior were these ones that we didn't know about going in, that we kind of uncovered. They got very quiet. And they told us that they had already assigned teams and invested resources to developing new solutions around those categories that they had already identified. In fact, they were willing to go develop where the opportunity was, but what we did was we failed to tell them that, yes, we learned about your categories, and there are other areas that were more fruitful. So when we said it that way, they were able to let go of the plans they'd already made and focus their development efforts and investment on where the research pointed them. That's what we have time for right now, and all these things got mentioned at the outset. A podcast, Dollars to Donuts, is profiles of people who are running in-house research teams, and they're leaders. So they talk about what it takes to do that. 2 books, Interviewing Users, takes what we talked about today and expands on it in a lot more detail. Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries is a lot of stories from researchers about what happens when you go out into the world and talk to people, and how we kind of learn from those surprising, challenging experiences. Feel free to connect with me, and I'd like to hear from everybody about what you think and what you're still looking for. Now we're almost free to go and do other things besides this. So thank you very much for your time. Have a great evening.